Okay, I'm going to try to violate all academic custom and make 8 points in 8 minutes. This is would be very unusual if I succeeded. We need, from a climate change point of view, I'm going to start with climate change but end up somewhere else. From a climate change point of view, as is pretty well known now, we need very large emission reductions far beyond Kyoto. If we want to stabilize atmospheric concentrations at low levels, that will prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference. It's probably roughly a 2-degree average global temperature rise that marks that boundary. There's some consensus now on that. Then we need to stabilize at something like 400 parts per million of CO2 equivalent, which means lower for CO2. That's outside the bounds of most of the analysis that's been done to date, but the new findings that we're going to hear about next month are so disturbing that the needs are for even lower concentration limits. To stabilize at those kinds of levels, we need global reductions in the order of 40 to 80% relative to 1990 of CO2 emissions. So by 2050 or so. So that's the kind of challenge. Non-trivial would be an understatement, given the pervasiveness of energy in our system. However, the good news is and the second point is such reductions are technically and indeed even economically viable and feasible. We have now over 30 years of studies going back to before climate change was the issue, when it was all about energy. All the energy studies just got renamed in 1988 and became climate change studies. But we have about 30 years of studies, the results of which are almost universally the same all over the world. That very large reductions in energy intensity through efficiency gains and conservation, which are different things, and very large potentials for alternative energy development and non-fossil fuel development. The most recent study just came out last week from Greenpeace at the global level. The most recent Canadian one was Ralph Torrey's study done for the National Roundtable, which talked about a 60% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 from today's levels as being quite technologically feasible with more or less today's technology. That just reproduces this endless message we've had decade after decade after decade. I fear we're in November 1974 every 5 years in the energy field, ever since 1974. We know what needs to be done, and we know roughly what it would take technically and economically to do it. But we seem incapable of actually acting on that. And that's my third point. We failed completely to act on this massive amount of data and information. This is a problem that's been studied arguably more than anything else. There's nothing like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for any other issue in the world. Thousands of scientists every 4 years produce this massive 3-volume report on the science, on adaptation and impacts, and on mitigation. But we don't seem able to act. We seem paralyzed by inaction specifically on this issue. I think one reason is that we have to recognize, and this is my fourth point, that we can't achieve the results that these studies say are available through energy policy or climate policy alone. It will never happen. The things that need to happen in order to achieve these goals go far beyond environment policy. In fact, environment ministries have within their jurisdiction a tiny fraction of the issues, almost none in fact, of the really big issues that need to be dealt with in terms of emission reduction. Land use planning, maybe the biggest single climate policy in this part of the world, a little farther east, would be if GVRD could actually make its livable region strategic plan happen. That's a land use planning policy. Huge implications for carbon emissions and indeed for adaptation. We've got to get out of the energy box and start thinking, and this is my next point, about climate change as a sustainability issue. We know from the scenario work that's been done that if you do sustainability right, you can attain your climate change goals through those policies with very little additional measures needed. If you don't do that, you can't get there. We cannot, through climate policy, get to the levels of emission reduction that we need. We have to somehow create sustainable futures that talk about land use, talk about transportation infrastructure, talk about urban form, talk about lifestyle and consumption in ways that go way outside the box of energy policy or climate policy. So the climate problem is fundamentally, I think, a sustainability problem. Now my sixth point, I think it's the sixth, is that the fundamental barriers to achieving our sustainability goals, again, are not primarily technical or economic. They're almost all, without exception, institutional. They're to do with codes, standards, norms, incentives, reward systems, all of the factors that constrain us in our lives are not fundamentally technical and economic. It would help a lot if we got the price right, but getting the price right alone won't do it either. If you have building codes that prevent sustainable buildings from going ahead, if you have a capital operating split in institutions where the capital guys don't care about operating costs, that's not their job, and the operating guys don't have any capital so they can't invest in reducing operating costs, you're just fundamentally constrained, independent of your desire. This isn't about convincing people of the importance. This is about changing the rules of the game that dictate how they operate. This is the governance issue, I think, that's the most important one that we have to deal with. My second last point is we have to also stop blaming the victim and stop acting as if individual behavior was the linchpin of the climate change problem. We could convince everyone in Canada to take all of the steps that are available to them as individuals, as homeowners, in terms of retrofitting their house or driving less to work. We're not even going to get close. The fundamental problem has to do with these big collective decisions on things like infrastructure and land use and so on. The reason we want to engage the public, I think, is less telling them how evil they are for driving to work when they're 40 kilometers from work and there's no transit available, and mobilizing them as a constituency for the policy changes that are needed to actually get us where we want to go. That's why we need public involvement, public community engagement. We also know that guilt-tripping people and blaming people is a bad basis for behavior change. And what happens when you're blamed and made to feel guilty? Creative innovation? And, I don't think so. It's just the opposite. You hunker down and you go into denial, or you go into a process of sort of apathy. So we need to rethink our whole way of engaging people. We need to focus on the collective decisions. My final point, therefore, is that we need more behaviorally sophisticated approaches based on three things. Addressing these institutional barriers, forget the potential estimates. We just see endless studies. We don't need those anymore. Let's focus on the rules of the game that prevent us from acting. Number two, motivating public support. Let's create a process where we have the whole population of this province actively engaged with interactive gaming tools. Just for one example, some of you may know that we do a lot of that work, on thinking about what kind of neighborhood we want our kids to grow up in. That's the question. That's the sustainability question. And then third, creating partnerships with the private sector, because they're the ones who do everything to the planet, for better or ill. The public sector, because the rules have to be right or you can't do the right things. The NGO sector for creative ideas, innovation, and social license to operate. And I think the research sector has a small role to play as well. And create those four-way partnerships to start making things happen on the ground right now as a way of changing the world.